want to start with the Big 12, where we have a three-way tie for first in the league standings between Kansas, Iowa State, and Kansas State. Raise your hand if you saw this coming. Kansas, sure. It's Bill Self and the Jayhawks. Nothing surprising about them sitting atop the league standings, even though Baylor was the preseason favorite. But the fact that it's Iowa State and Kansas State tied with Kansas atop the Big 12 standings is undeniably surprising relative to preseason expectations. Iowa State was picked 8th in the preseason Big 12 poll. That's 8 out of 10. Kansas State was picked to finish dead last, 10th in the Big 12. And maybe they'll still finish there. Long season and all that. But right now, Kansas State and Iowa State are a combined 26-3 overall. Both are, just like Kansas, 3-0 in the league. I've got Kansas 3rd in the top 25-1. Kansas State 7th. Iowa State 13th. Dead leg. What do you make of the top of the Big 12 standings right now?
All right, a few things. First of all, anyone listening, go back. We're, minute and a half into this podcast. Make sure my man didn't say camel biting instead of camel fighting. I might have heard camel biting dodo birds and leaky black. So maybe he's getting kinky with it. I don't know what that was all about. But I'm gonna need an audio fact check from my man GP there. Number 2. I was on the slopes on Saturday, so I was in and out of some hoop stuff. So as we get going with this episode, I did keep track, but I didn't watch these games closely. I was riding Killington here, getting some good spiritual time on the mountain. And the most, we're going to get to it later. I can't believe that Arizona lost to Washington State. So let's talk Big 12. But that one, to me, might be the most shocking result of the weekend here. Big 12 is starting to have some interesting separation. So Kansas continues to be the story we've talked about all season long, basically. Only one loss to Tennessee. It's now 3-0. Notable in that it was able to go on the road and win 2 straight games. But the games it won being Texas Tech last Tuesday and then getting the win at West Virginia. Not even really all that competitive on the road on Saturday. Both West Virginia and Texas Tech are not shaping up to be tournament teams, and we've mentioned on the pod previously. Big 12 rates as the best league, and Ken Palmett's had all of its teams within basically the top 50, and that is still the case as we talk here on Sunday night, January 8th. But West Virginia and Texas Tech both being 0-3 in the league, and I actually think they're going to be in some real danger of not making the tournament. I would list Texas Tech as a team whose tournament hopes haven't expired. I just don't think they're getting there. They don't have a win in the top 140 overall, and they're 0-3, and they didn't schedule well, and the opportunities they had in Maui, they lost those games there. So Mark Adams might be running out of time here. Yeah, if they were able to turn it around and go from 0-3 to 10-4 in the league, then we got a different situation. There's just nothing to indicate that's going to be the case whatsoever. So on the bottom end, I actually think we're starting to get some separation. We'll get to Baylor in just a second because obviously that's extremely notable. But yeah, let's have a coda on Kansas State because at 14-1 and 3-0 overall, Jerome Tang has hit the Tommy Lloyd phase of his debut as a head coach, a longtime assistant at one program, and at 20 years, 2 decades, right? It's the same path in that regard. Then they travel to get their first big time job as a head coach. And yes or no, Jerome Tang is your front runner for National Coach of the Year right now, GP.
Has to be right now. Yeah, you can make cases for a lot of different people, but I don't know how you would put anybody reasonably at the top of a ballot right now other than Jerome Tang. Again, first-year head coach, and inherited a program that only won 14 games last season, was picked to finish dead last in his league. And I can't speak for AP voters, but if you just look at the resume, it's hard not to have Kansas State in the top 10 right now.
You said you had him 7, right?
Yeah, I jumped them all the way up. It's one thing to beat West Virginia at home to get your first big win of the season, which is what Kansas State did last weekend. But when you back that, and think about this, I can't remember if I said it on this podcast or on, when I do a Tuesday hit with Soren Petro in Kansas City. But at one point I said, listen, this could be a comeback to earth week for Kansas State because you got to go to Texas, you got to go to Baylor. If you're Jerome Tang, you'd split them. You take a split and be thrilled. But the likely scenario is that Kansas State goes 0-2 this week. And Kansas State instead went 2-0 in the week. Beat Texas at Texas 116-103. Beat Baylor at Baylor 97-95 in OT. I don't think anybody in the country's got 2 road wins that impressive on the resume so far. And when you're sitting here with the lone loss being a true road loss at Butler, Butler's not great, but it's a true road loss at Butler. The resume is strong. I've seen enough. I think this is one of the 10 best teams in the country right now.
Have to be rated as that in terms of how they're playing and reflected, certainly since they haven't lost since the Butler loss. They only have one loss, and that was in November. So they have gone since the start of December without a scratch and getting the wins at Texas. Again, dropping 116. That was a program record. K-State had never had 116 in a game until January 3, and then winning on the road against Baylor. Full transparency, I did not see that game. In fact, I think I tried to maybe I don't remember where I was, but I don't think that game was on regular TV, right? Was that an ESPN Plus special on Saturday?
Dude, we got to a point Saturday night, like late Saturday afternoon, Saturday night, where like Kansas and West Virginia and Kansas State and Baylor might have both been like streaming games. It was just weird to be streaming. Yes. I mean, like, it's the way of the future. It's the way of the present, I guess. But there were two significant Big 12 games at the same time that were streaming only options, I believe.
Yeah, and that goes back to in the preseason, they get put on streaming in part because Kansas State isn't expected to be that good. That game might necessarily be such, a must-watch game, and then it turns into just exactly that. So yeah, 14-1. And for Baylor, I don't know, GP. I mentioned this a few shows ago. In terms of Baylor, it's just not going to be the Baylor we've known. Now lost 3 in a row. They're all the good teams. They're all the teams that we think are going to be in the tournament. At Iowa State, by 1 at home to TCU, by 2 at home in overtime to Kansas State. They are understandable losses, but you picked up 5. And as we've mentioned plenty of times on the pod, the other 2 are to Virginia on a neutral. It was a good game, but Virginia clearly deserved to win that game. And then they got destroyed on the road against Marquette, and then they also got destroyed against Iowa State. So having not seen how the game played out, I can't speak to to the ebb and flow of that. But it was an important spot there for the Bears, because now they do have to go on the road and play West Virginia in the league. In the league, there's just no gimmies there before they get Oklahoma State this weekend. I don't know where we'll go with Baylor. It feels like their range of outcomes over the next 2 months are pretty wide, because they've shown they can beat good teams. They have wins over UCLA and Gonzaga. Those are the 2 best. They beat Washington State, which beat Arizona. We are also, I think what this weekend showed wasn't a mega, tremendous weekend with stuff up and down the slate, but we did get some results that are providing perhaps a refreshing reminder of just how much our expectations can get tossed sideways. Just, stay on your toes here, because the idea that, the top 5 to 10 teams are just going to be borderline automatic gimmies for victories when they're playing sub 50 competition just isn't necessarily the case. So with that in mind, Baylor I still think this is a top. They're not playing like a top 25 team. I still think they will wind up as that, but you lose enough, you're in a tough league. You never know how a group of young men is going to respond to that. So for me, Parrish, over the next 2 weeks, I would list Baylor among my 4 or 5 teams to watch, just to see how they respond to this, and if they get better, or if we might have a situation where it's just one of those teams that they're good, the record doesn't show it, they get to the tournament, but they stumble on the way there, and maybe they're going to be a danger no matter the seed next to their name. But I could see their outcome being anything between this point, I'd say a 3 seed is the ceiling. And if you told me they dropped down to like a 9, I wouldn't put it out of the question, just because they've really gotten handled in a couple of these games. So I don't think they can hit that elite top tier status kind of team later this season.
I'm not as concerned about Baylor as you are. I still have Baylor in the top 25-1. Like, they have as you pointed out, they've beaten good teams. So it's not like some of these disappointing teams in the country, you go, man, they didn't beat anybody all year. Kentucky, we'll get to it. But this team has beaten UCLA, beaten Gonzaga, and the losses are literally all to teams I also have in the top 25-1. So for my purposes, that's still a rankable team. Keep in mind, Adam Flagler has missed some time. LJ Cryer has missed some time. And I know you didn't see much or any of the game, but, it went to overtime. That by definition means, one shot,
Did it go to over? Just a genuine question. Did it go to overtime because it was a volleyball match, or did it go to overtime because Baylor needed to salvage it, or did
No,
Baylor...
yeah, Kansas State controlled most of the game. That's true.
Okay.
Kansas State controlled most of the game. But like you look at these last two losses, and they're losses. I'm not going to try to pretend they're wins. They're losses. But one of them's a 1-point loss, and the other one's an overtime loss. I mean, literally one stop or one make in both those games, and maybe you're 12-3 instead of sitting here at 10-5. So I'm not as concerned about them. I think the bigger now, it is notable that, you know, a Baylor team that was picked to win the Big 12 is 0-3 in the Big 12. That's a bullet point, no question. If you're building a news and notes graphic for Inside College Basketball, you put that on there. But to me, the real story from the weekend is Kansas State continuing to solidify itself as a legitimate Big 12 title contender. And I went and I wrote about this in Sunday Morning's Top 25 and 1. If you missed it, you can check it out there. If you've read it, you're going to hear a lot of the same stuff again. But when you take a look at this Kansas State roster with fresh eyes, it shouldn't be like they've got good players. Sometimes you see a team's good and you go, I don't know why they're so good or why they keep winning. Like the players aren't, this doesn't really make sense. Maybe the coach is a magician. And clearly, I'm not trying to take away from what Jerome Tang is doing. What he is doing is amazing. He would be my, choice for coach of the year right now. But, think about because it's pretty clear everybody misevaluated Kansas State. The Big 12 coaches picked them last. I went and looked at our Big 12 preview. Literally every one of us, me, you, David Cobb, Kyle Boone, Jerry Palm, picked Kansas State to finish last. Everybody misevaluated Kansas State. So how does that happen? Where does it start? It starts with Keontae Johnson. We didn't know what he was going to be. Nobody could reasonably guess. Nobody could reasonably assume he's going to be the same player he was 2 years ago. For people who don't know the backstory, he was at Florida, voted preseason SEC Player of the Year heading into the 2020-21 season, and then he collapses on 12-12-20 and a game against Florida State. And I know he stepped on the court one time last season, so he officially appeared in one game for Florida last season, but he never played again. He had not played since 12-12-20 heading into this season, and nearly 2 years away from basketball. So it was totally understandable to be unsure of what he was going to be. Totally reasonable to be skeptical that he'd be the same player. You know what? He's at least the same player and maybe better. He's averaging 18.8 points, 7-point rebounds, and shooting 41.7% from three. He's a Big 12 Player of the Year candidate right now, along with one of his teammates, Marquise Noel, and probably Jalen Wilson. So what if I'd have told you in the preseason, instead of, Keontae Johnson, the guy who collapsed at Florida and hasn't played in 2 years, he's going to Kansas State. What if I told you Keontae Johnson, the guy who was the preseason SEC Player of the Year heading into the 2020-21 season, is now at Kansas State, and he's going to be just as good, if not better, than he's ever been? Well, that changes things, all right? Now let's go to Marquise Noel. He's developed into one of the nation's best point guards. And I don't know if we could have saw this coming, but he is clearly one of the nation's best point guards right now. I'm assuming you saw this stat. It came from the king of ESPN stats and info, Jared Burson, on Saturday night. He tweeted that.
Does not work for ESPN as a reminder.
I know, but it's still the king of ESPN stats and info, as far as I'm concerned, and forever will be, whether he's got an office or not. So in Saturday's win against Baylor, Noel got 32 points, 14 assists. Earlier in the week against Texas, got 36 points, 9 assists. Did you see this on Twitter? Okay. So Marquise Noel just became the third player in the past 10 seasons to get 65 plus points and 20 plus assists in any 2-game span. The other two, trivia time. It's trivia time. Who were the other two?
Say it one more time, please.
Only 3 players in the past 10 years have gotten at least 65 points and at least 20 assists, or I should phrase it the way he did. 65 plus points and 20 plus assists in any 2-game span. First 2 games, last 2 games, anything in the middle. Only 2 other players have done it.
Trae Young
is one of them. That's very good.
Last 10 seasons. Give me a conference.
If I give you the conference, it's going to give it away. And the school.
Okay, hold on. Then I will say Nigel Williams-Goss.
No, not Okay, I could give you the conference, but it's not even. This school's not even in that conference anymore.
Ja Morant.
Ja Morant.
Give it to me. Let's go. Did not swear. Didn't see it. Are you kidding me? The beard stuff broke on Thursday. Had to do that. Twitter was shut down for me from better part of 3 days. So I did not see that.
So the top of Kansas State's roster is Keontae Johnson and a dude who's doing things only Ja Morant and Trae Young have done in the past 10 years. Third leading scorer is Naquan Tomlin, JUCO All-American. Fourth leading scorer, Desi Sills. Started for an Arkansas team 2 years ago that made the Elite Eight. That's talent. Kansas State's got real players. And I don't think this is fluky. I think they're legitimately good. Now legitimately good can still have you finishing 7th in the Big 12. So I'm not ruling anything out. But I think sometimes you see teams get off to good starts or, hey, the first half of the season went really well, but I'm not so sure. I'm convinced. I've seen enough from Kansas State. I think they're legitimately good because Jerome Tang's doing an amazing job and because they've got legitimately high-level players at the top of that roster.
You listened to this podcast and you didn't think Nigel Williams-Goss would get referenced, but you were wrong. Iowa State also in the top of that. So before we transition to the rest of the weekend, let's touch on the Cyclones real quick here because they are putting on, a nice follow-up, sophomore season here for Otzelberger as a head coach and getting wins home against Baylor, at Oklahoma. Oklahoma, oh, by the way, gets the win at Texas Tech, and they were just aching for a good win. The Big 12 is going to get at least 6 into the tournament. It will be interesting to see how all this shakes out. Oklahoma might be the unsuspecting candidate in that mix there, but wins like it was able to get on Saturday, I think, are big. But yeah, Iowa State has beaten Oklahoma on the road, got that Wednesday, and then got the win over a TCU team that had not lost but since mid-November there, and that's obviously a big one. So they continue to be just a pugnacious defensive unit, and going on the road and spoiling TCU's weekend here, which, by the way, we're not getting out of this podcast before we're picking the title game. So just remind me before we get out of here on that. Good on them for doing it. I did look up their numbers right now from a tournament perspective. So right now, Iowa State sitting top 20 in the net rankings. It's 3-2 in quad 1, 2-0 in quad 2. Doesn't have a bad loss yet. Pretty sure I mentioned this on a recent episode. I think I said it in these terms. Iowa State could be a team that takes on a lot of losses, but their seed winds up being better than you think it might be, just looking at the record at first glance. Maybe it won't be that. Maybe Iowa State will be able to maintain top 3 status in a really, really good league, the best league in America, and push its way to one of its best seeds that it's had in the past 20, 25 years. I do think that's possible. That's on the table. Next is at home against a Texas Tech team. You got to figure Iowa State will probably never say anything. Never say never in this league. But if it gets there, it's going to be 4-0 before tremendous, just big time game at Kansas this weekend. But no, Otzelberger is getting it done, and he's getting it done, having needed to reshape a roster 2 seasons in a row, and kind of going against that trope you've talked about here this season, where the excuses for early coaches in their early years, year 1, year 2, because of roster turnover. Well, there are guys that are not even proving to be exceptions to the rule, but just kind of proving the trope to be often inaccurate, and they continue to be good. Gabe Kalsher has played well alongside Caleb Grill, who's had a couple of really nice games this season. And yeah, Iowa State's going to go to the tournament in back-to-back years. And just on this point real quick, you had when K-State finally got rid of Weber, and that was like 4 or 5 years coming. A super nice guy, really, really good coach, but that fan base was wanting that for a number of years. And with Iowa State, it was, pining for a change. And sometimes the ones that care the most can wind up being right about these things. And those changes were made, and look what's happened with both of those spots. What's going on in Ames, and then down in the Little Apple in Manhattan, Kansas. They've got new guys in charge, and the programs are ascending, and they are relevant. And those are 2 top 15 teams right now.
Yeah, like I said, I've got Kansas State 7th. I've got Iowa State 13th. The Cyclones are 3-2 in quadrant 1, 2-0 in quadrant 2. So 5-2 in the first 2 quadrants, no additional losses. That absolutely is the resume. As somebody who looks at this stuff every morning, that is the resume of a top 15 team. And we'll see where it goes from here. But quite clearly, Kansas State and Iowa State, along with Kansas, which is there every year, turning into the stories out of the Big 12 and some of the best stories in college basketball.